Sir Philip Sidney, in his great essay on poetry, said poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom. And I think it has to begin in delight, and the delight has to stay there all the way, or it never is going to end up in wisdom.
Home, for W.S. Merwin, is a dwelling half hidden by a tropical forest on the island of Maui. It runs on solar energy, the choice of Merwin, who is a well-known environmentalist. Here, he and his wife Paula spend most of the year enjoying the isolation and tranquility of this remote location. In 1977, Merwin purchased this acreage, which was covered with low-lying brush. Over the next 27 years, he planted the trees that have converted these 18 acres into a tropical landscape. It contains 800 species of palm trees from around the world.
I love the city, but I also love the country, and I realize that when I'm in the city, I miss the country all the time. When I'm in the country, I miss the city some of the time. So what I do now is live in the country and go to the city some of the time. But I can't imagine living in the country without being part of it, without growing things, without doing something. Writing poetry has, to me, always had something to do with how you want to live. I guess I've done something that a lot of my contemporaries didn't do. Many of them went into universities and had academic careers, and I have nothing against that. I mean, I don't preach against that and say what a terrible thing. I think it's a fine thing if that's what you're made for, but I didn't think I was made for it. I begin, after about a week in the university, I begin to feel the oxygen's going out of the air very fast, and I have to go somewhere else.
William Stanley Merwin was born in 1927 and spent his early years in Union City, across the river from Manhattan. His father, a strict disciplinarian, was a local Presbyterian minister.
I always knew that I wanted to write poems. From the very beginning, when I first could put words together and write them down on a page in my childish handwriting, I didn't write little bits of prose. I wrote poems. I wanted to write verses. My models were Stevenson's Child's Garden of Verses. Where Go the Boats is still one of my favorite poems, or Tennyson's The Brook, which my mother read to me, which I'm still very fond of. And of course the hymns in my father's church that I heard when I was a child. I didn't care for the sermons, but I did care for listening to the hymns. The idea of writing, to me, from the beginning, was writing something which was a little different from the ordinary exchange of speech. It was something that had a certain formality, something in which the words were of interest in themselves, and that's the beginning of the feeling about poetry.
At 16, he was admitted to Princeton University on a scholarship, where he studied writing with such poets as John Berryman and R.P. Blackmer, and received advice from another major poet.
I went to see Ezra Pound when I was 18, when I was in college. He was in the psycho ward at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which was the way his defense lawyer had saved him from being shot for treason for the things he'd said during World War II. The plea of insanity, they said that he was crazy, and he probably was a little crazy. I knew nothing about his politics, fortunately, and he, to my amazement now, took me seriously as a poet. He decided this is a young man who says he wants to be a poet, and he accepted that. And he said, if you want to be a poet, you have to take it seriously. You have to work on it the way you would work on anything else, and you have to do it every day. He said you should write about 75 lines a day. You know, Pound was a great one for laying down the law about how you did anything. And he said, and you don't have anything to write 75 lines about a day. He said, you don't really have anything to write about. He said, at the age of 18, you think you do, but you don't. And he said, the way to do it is to learn a language and translate. And he said, that way you can practice and you can find out what you can do with your language. He said, you can learn a foreign language, but the translation is your way of learning your own language.
After leaving Princeton, Merwin supported himself as a tutor for the children of wealthy families in France and Portugal. Eventually, he moved on to Majorca, where he tutored the son of poet Robert Graves. During these years, following Pound's advice, he started to translate poems from Latin, French, and Spanish sources.
It occurred to me that if I was going to do what I really wanted to do, I wasn't going to be able to think too much about money. And obviously I wasn't going to have it. And very early in my life, I didn't care about that. I thought as long as I can be independent and not too anxious about where the next meal's coming from, that's all right. I don't need to have more money than that. And I remember when I finally reached the point when I had $12,000, I felt rather ashamed of myself. I thought, I don't need that much money.
In 1952, he achieved his breakthrough as a poet. W.H. Auden awarded him the Yale Younger Poets Prize for his first book of published poems, which were formal and medieval in their overtones, an influence of Robert Graves.
Where do the ideas for your poems come from?
For me, it begins with hearing a dimension of words. Hearing maybe the sound of words, it may be a phrase that I've heard someone say in the street that I've heard all my life, and I think, that's got it. It's got that electric current in it. I never heard it before, but there it is. And it's part of a poem. And where it goes from there, once it's alive, it begins to pick up the things that belong with it and to make a poem. And gradually I find out what the poem is about, if you find out too much about it, if the idea becomes too clear too early, you're probably not going to write a poem. It's probably going to turn into prose. But because the poem is going to surprise you right to the very end. The next line is not going to come from where you think it's going to come from. And I think that's very, very important, that element of surprise, which begins with hearing words in the first place. This is a poem that I wrote about 20 years ago, one of a series of poems, as it turned out, that had to do with family relations, and it's called Yesterday. My friend says, I was not a good son, you understand. I say, yes, I understand. He says, I did not go to see my parents very often, you know. And I say, yes, I know. Even when I was living in the same city, he says, maybe I would go there once a month or maybe even less. I say, oh, yes. He says, the last time I went to see my father, I say, the last time I saw my father. He says, the last time I saw my father, he was asking me about my life, how I was making out, and he went into the next room to get something to give me. Oh, I say, feeling again the cold of my father's hand the last time. He says, and my father turned in the doorway and saw me look at my wristwatch, and he said, you know, I would like you to stay and talk with me. Oh, yes, I say. But if you are busy, he said, I don't want you to feel that you have to just because I'm here. I say nothing. He says, my father said, maybe you have important work you are doing, or maybe you should be seeing somebody. I don't want to keep you. I look out the window. My friend is older than I am. He says, and I told my father it was so. And I got up and left him then, you know, though there was nowhere I had to go and nothing I had to do.
In the 60s and 70s, ever restless, Merwin spent time in England, and for a period was headquartered in a farmhouse in the south of France. Later, he moved to Mexico for several years. Nevertheless, he would continually return to an apartment he kept in New York, which overlooked the Twin Towers. During his wanderings, he joined a circle of young poets in Boston, which included Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath, and Robert Lowell. It was at this time he turned towards American themes.
I think every writer that I know, somewhere around them, nearby, has got a little notebook. And they're never very far from that little notebook. I've carried a little spiral notebook all my life and put little notes in the notebook as they occur to me. And then I write things out longhand. I can't imagine doing it any other way. I can't imagine ever writing anything on any kind of machine. I never wrote a poem. I never tried to write either poetry or prose on a typewriter. I like to do it on useless paper, scrap paper, because it's of no importance. If I put a nice new sheet of white paper down in front of myself and took up a nice new, nicely sharpened anything, and it would be instant inhibition, I think. So now what, you know? And I would sit there, so now what, for quite a long time. But if it's something that happens and I need somewhere to write it down, it'll be the back of an envelope or something like that. And then it's okay, you know, because it's just to keep it there until I can find out where it goes from there. This is a poem that I wrote a few years ago when we had all been thinking about the passage of a very great comet. It's called The Comet Museum. So the feeling comes afterward. Some of it may reach us only long afterward, when the moment itself is beyond reckoning, beyond time, beyond memory. As though it were not moving in heaven, neither burning farther through any past, nor ever to arrive again in time to be. When it is gone, the senses wake. All through the day they wait for it. Here are pictures that someone took of what escaped us at the time. Only now can we remember.
In a career spanning 5 decades, W.S. Merwin has published 20 books of poetry. These works feature a particular stylistic device. On the written page, there is no punctuation.
What led you to eliminate punctuation when writing your poems?
Well, from reading prose, a lot of prose, I began to feel, especially in the 19th century, that it was over-punctuated and that these long, elaborate sentences, which were written sentences, were held together by the elaborate punctuation. And I got impatient with that kind of punctuation, which seemed more and more to me to be the protocol of prose. And poetry, I believe, begins with hearing something, with hearing language. It begins with the way we speak language and communicate without it being written down. And I think that's always a dimension that's there. I think poetry is always physical in that sense. It begins with a sense. And the way to make that clear is to do with less and less punctuation. Let the movement of the language do the punctuating, as it does when we talk to each other. We don't have little commas in the air. People do this, which always irritates me very much. You shouldn't have to do that.
Recognized as one of America's leading poets, Merwin has received a number of prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize. Although appreciative of these honors, he jealously guards his privacy at his secluded retreat on Maui. Without fax machine or email, he enjoys the contemplative way of life he shares with Paula.
This is a poem that I wrote in the early 80s, shortly after I met Paula, my wife. It's called Late Spring. Coming into the high room again after years, after oceans and shadows of hills and the sounds of lies, after losses and feet on stairs, after looking and mistakes and forgetting, turning there thinking to find no one except those I knew, finally I saw you sitting in white, already waiting. You of whom I had heard with my own ears since the beginning, for whom more than once I had opened the door, believing you were not far. I want to read a poem from a very different kind of place and outlook called To Lingering Regrets. Without wanting to, I have come slowly to admit that I know who you are one by one. Oh, lovely and mournful with downcast eyes, appearing to me as you are turning away to stand silent and late in a remembered light touched with amber.
Several times a year, Merwin leaves Maui to give poetry readings at libraries, colleges, and universities across the United States.
You are the foolish virgins with no oil for your lamps. and no one else to lead you where you want to go. This is a poem that was written in the days following the horrors of September the 11th. You may have run across it. I mean, it's been published and it was been on the radio and things. You know, I wasn't deliberately fishing, trying to write about that, but the poems kept coming up like fish to the surface, and all of us in this room know that not a day has passed since then that we haven't thought about those events, and they haven't waked us up at night. So that's what the poems had to do with too. And this one is called To the Words. When it happens, you are not there. Oh, you beyond numbers, beyond recollection, passed on from breath to breath, given again from day to day, from age to age, charged with knowledge, knowing nothing. Indifferent elders, indispensable and sleepless, keepers of our names before ever we came to be called by them. You that were formed to begin with, you that were cried out, you that were spoken to begin with, to say what could not be said. Ancient, precious, and helpless ones, say it. Thank you. All my life I've thought when I finish a poem, there's no guarantee that I'll write another one. If you feel, as I do, that the next poem comes from some totally unknown place, how can you know that you're going to write another poem? I know that I go on listening all the time, and I know that I take notes on anything that I think I hear, and they may turn into poems.